Hello and welcome to the final day of the 2022 conference for the program on race, inequality, language, and education here at Stanford University's Graduate School of Education. My name is Brian Brown, and I have the privilege of serving as the chair for the program for the 2021-2022 academic year. And on behalf of my colleagues, I just want to thank you all for joining us today. As we think through some important issues in education, as we share research publicly, our goal is to build a collaborative of people who are thinking about ways to improve education. We want to communicate with each other. Today's session is session 5, and the theme for today is Beyond the Headlines, Correcting Misconceptions and Considering the Potential of Critical Race Theory in Schools. Quickly, in 1995, I was in a bookstore, Marcus Bookstore in West Oakland, California. And as I would, standing there, someone asked me, what are you looking for? And without having an answer, I was handed a book. And that book was Derek Bell's And We Are Not Saved. I read this book and was amazed as I was given a vision of what would happen if we thought about how race played a role in the decision-making of those who are writing policy, as race was talked about and discussed openly and honestly in the decision-making of Brown versus the Board of Education. And what Bell did was give us a vision for how we should think critically about the role of race in society. So today, we have two world-class scholars to really walk us through an in-depth analysis of what is really happening relative to critical race theory and how it's being represented. And to offer a better introduction of these scholars, I'm going to introduce one of our fabulous graduate students, Brian Cabral. So Brian Cabral is a Chicago native, a sociologist and PhD candidate in the program for race inequality and language here at Stanford. His intellectual interests lie in the intersection of race, place, and language and causality. Currently, his research focuses on re-articulating contemporary school carceral logics and relations and modes of confinement from multiple contradictory carceral and abolitionist perspectives. Brian is a phenomenal scholar and future leader, and we welcome Brian as our moderator today. Brian?
Thank you, Dr. Brown. Am I unmuted? Yes, I'm unmuted. Y'all can hear me? Yes, yep. So I'm gonna get us started by introducing both of our scholars here today. And I'm gonna begin with Dr. Subini Annamma, and also happy belated birthday to you. And so Dr. Annamma is an associate professor in the Graduate School of Education here at Stanford University. Her research critically examines the way students are criminalized and resist that criminalization through the mutually constitutive nature of racism and ableism. How racism and ableism interlock with other marginalizing oppressions, and how these intersections impact youth education trajectories in urban schools and youth prisons. Further, she positions students as knowledge generators, exploring how their narratives can inform teacher and special education. So, Dr. Annamma, we're excited for you to be here, but you're not here by yourself. We also have Dr. Cheryl Matias, who's a professor and director of secondary teacher education at the University of Kentucky. Her research focuses on race and ethnic studies in education with a theoretical focus on critical race theory, or CRT, critical whiteness studies, which we'll delve into a little bit later, critical pedagogy, and feminisms of color. Specifically, she uses a feminist of color approach to deconstruct the emotionality of whiteness in urban teacher education and how it impacts urban education more broadly. So that's the formal sort of introduction to both of these scholars. And I am here tasked to serve as the moderator for this conversation. And so let's just delve right, is that okay? We just delve right in? Okay, so while I wanna begin talking a little bit more broadly about CRT, critical race theory, and the original scholarship. So critical race theory emerged from research on law. It has also been applied to the education research space. Can either of you or both of you talk about the original research and how it applies to education research? And maybe we can begin with Dr. Annamma.
Oh, I was hoping we were going to begin with Dr. Matthias because I just want to listen to her spit some knowledge. But all right, I'll give this a go. Thank you, everyone, for having me. I'm speaking to you from the unceded lands of the Ramaytush Ohlone people, that is now San Francisco. where enslaved Africans were forced to be part of the gold rush, near where the Chinese Exclusion Act was enforced with bureaucratic efficiency at Angel Island, where the Mendez family won a suit against school segregation in the 50s, but the Latinx population, along with Black families, began to be pushed out by the 70s. This land has stories of violence and resistance that have been enacted here. For me, and my work is rooted in the legal academic scholarship of critical race theory, given my commitments to study how racism and ableism impact the criminalization of multiply marginalized youth of color, and how to dismantle the criminal punishment system. So understanding the CRT roots matter to me as a scholar. And I also think the legal roots matter to education researchers at large. Much of Derek Bell's original work was about school segregation. So the fact is that the legal theory applied to education from the beginning, but even more than that, the foundations of CRT matter for how we understand the legal tenets going forward. So I think this original question about how the original research applies to education is about intellectual lineage. Lucille Clifton has a poem called Here Yet Be Dragons, where she talks about languages that have fallen off the edge of the world and into the dragon's mouth. How does losing the foundations of CRT allow them to fall into the dragon's mouth? I think we have to keep thinking about that because our origins matter to our understandings. So in order to build, we first need to understand the foundations. So when I teach CRT, I teach through the tenets, and I always begin with how they originated in law and then how they've been expanded to education. And when I write, I return to the origins of the tenets in law, and I also look to their intellectual lineage. So for example, I root my work in Crenshaw's conception of intersectionality, but I also look to how Black women and other women of color have been discussing the ways racism and sexism influence the social conditions of their lives, including Anna Julia Cooper, Audre Lorde, Gloria Anzaldúa, the Combahee River Collective, and critical race feminists such as Adrienne Wing. So my point is that we have to understand the original research to think about how it applies to education. So I'd love to hear, I know Dr. Matthias has different views on this, and I know she obviously honors the original intellectual lineage, and I would love to hear what she's thinking as well.
Hey everyone, how are you all doing? I'm actually, yes, I'm a professor at University of Kentucky, and it's so nice to share space with Subini. I just sending you so much love. I'm so happy for your appointment in Stanford. I'm actually zooming in today from the land of Tongva in the greater Los Angeles area. People know I'm based here, but I do make myself to Lexington every month. So I just wanted to say, I agree with Subini. I'm down with her. I'm with her. I think I have some slides. I got nerdy. Is that okay to share? I'm an A+ student. I got to do that, you know. Is it okay if I share the powers that be? Can I screen share? All right, I'm going to just screen share. So I use it as well. And I think some of the things that I focus on here, y'all can see that. I think you're just seeing some beautiful faces. Here we go. Oh my God, I don't want to see myself. Okay, so I kind of just sum it up like this, you know, defining CRT is a really important aspect. And we all know that it does stem from critical legal studies from law schools across the US and how they were going to use this as a transdisciplinary analytical tool, typically used, and this is how it's applied to education, used in higher ed, research, or law education to investigate the impacts laws, policies, and sanctions have on race. And we all know that it has various tenets. Now, these are all contested depending on, you know, different camps, but, you know, predominantly these are the knowledge of experiential knowledge, the commitment to social justice, challenging dominant narratives, interdisciplinary work, intersectionality of race, racism, alongside that of gender, class, ability, sexuality. I would even include language and citizenship. So I have that in the realms that I think and conceptualize CRT, because I know it comes from legal studies, but it's so fortuitous, is it, in its analytical capabilities, and that we can apply that analytical lens into education in ways that deconstructs how race and racism is happening within our educational system, whether it's K-12 or higher education, whether it's educational policy or teacher education practices. But we can really use this as a great formidable lens to understand how race is being impacted, also how is white supremacy eluding or embedded or imbued in some of these processes in education that we take for granted, right? And when I say I apply it to teacher education, to educational research, I think about it not only to analyze. I think there's one different component that education is really known for. A lot of us educators here in this space, over the 200 people here, is we're really committed to social justice. So that tenet too, just like rings at our heart. It's nothing we have to try on. It's something that we've been doing. And so that's why we latch to CRT in a lot of ways. And it applies to educational research in this nuanced way, because as we're analyzing the racism and the race and racism and the white supremacy in educational, we don't want to leave it just there. And because we believe education is so transformational, we believe that we can use this as a conduit to make change, right? In as much as it's colonizing and it's dehumanizing and it's imbued with racism and white supremacy, it can be a realm where we can transform it. And so I think when it's applied to educational research so beautifully, I'm just going to get out of here. I want to see your faces. I don't know how to get out. Okay. So when we think about it applying to how we do our educational research, we deconstruct the heck out of how race and racism is playing out. And for me, particularly teacher education and K-12 schools. And I think the important aspect here is we don't leave it at that. We believe in social justice so much that we think of ways, because we're educators, right? We're teachers, we're on the fly, we're constantly making teachable moments. We're finding ways to push back. And I think that's the way we engage in CRT in education. We're making something, we're moving and shaking. How's that?
Yeah, that's exactly it. And so I actually have more pointed questions to both of you. And we're going to start with you, Dr. Annamma, and then move on to Dr. Matthias. So your work is interdisciplinary, right? And this is for you, Dr. Annamma. Can you share a little bit about how your work uses critical race theory, right? You took up this challenge to embed that into your educational work. And in order to make phenomena visible that were not considered by those original scholars.
You know, this is such a rich question, and I want to always begin with crediting what was done before and building on that. One of the things I think academia loves to do is tear things down. And to me, I have no interest in doing such a thing, especially around critical race theory, but around so many of our intellectual ancestors. You didn't remember this, what about that? That's not useful for me. And that does not mean that some harmful things don't need to be called out, because they do. But generally, I enjoy generating knowledge. It's why I love abolition, which is about the imaginary and what comes next, as much as what is not working now. So for me, I needed CRT. I needed CRT. And I say that so passionately because I remember in grad school very much wanting to leave at one point, and the discovery of CRT shifting the ways I understood the world. So I needed it to examine the systemic issues of racism in order to see what was absent in CRT as well, which was issues of disability and ableism. And that way I could imagine what we could build together. I needed CRT scholars' definition of racism. So for example, in 1989, Mari Matsuda, one of our founders of critical race theory in law, stated racism compromises the ideology of racial supremacy and the mechanisms for keeping selective victim groups in subordinated positions. And so that really helped me understand that if racism is the ideology for situating specific people in subordinated locations, then ableism is how that goal is achieved. So by situating the learning, thinking, and behaviors of Black, Indigenous, and other people of color as less than or unequal. So racism and ableism are mutually constitutive in my mind, interdependent. They rely on each other, is a fancy way of saying, because they need each other to survive. Whiteness needed to other the subordinated group and did so through ableism. So Danny Solorzano has called DISCRIT, disability critical race theory, what myself and my colleagues Beth Ferry and David Connor wrote, a sibling of CRT. And I find that really a useful way to think of CRT. I've heard it talked about as branches, as offshoots, but to me it's a sibling because they are deeply as connected as kin. And the goal of Discrit was to offer CRT a way to distinguish the project of ableism from racism and to articulate how racism and ableism were mutually constitutive. So that is both the gift of CRT to me and hopefully what Discrit can do for CRT, and recognizing that they rely on each other has been really powerful for me.
Yeah, thank you for that answer. I think a lot of us, even now in graduate school, CRT allows us to ask different kinds of questions and to build from that foundation that you all have set for us. But Dr. Matthias, now over to you, because your work also extends the early text on critical race theory, and you talked wonderfully about the kind of benefits that education has had with implementing CRT tenets. But can you share a little bit more about how your research specifically builds on this original scholarship?
Absolutely. And I just wanted to honor a lot of what was said with, I think it should be said twice. And I tell this to Subini all the time, because they just read your piece just this past week in my class. So, and I think it's really important because what Subini did is she took the tenets of CRT and she extended it through the sibling type development of Discrit, right? And she took that interdisciplinary aspect and she took that intersectional aspect and really showed how we can make the field grow. And so I think that should be really recognized in the work that she does. And I really appreciate that. And it gives rise to other things like some of the work that I do with Parent Crit and thinking about how we can raise our children to have a really affirmed racial identity, and in ways where parent and child can engage in a mutual pedagogical process to both, bring us into racial identity awareness. So, but beyond that, so I'll be honest with you. So, I thought when I first went to Colorado, I was going to do some cool stuff when I became an assistant professor. I was going to do some critical hip hop pedagogy, CRT, culturally relevant teaching. But when I was the first faculty of color in the urban ed program at that time, I realized a lot of mechanisms were happening inside teacher education, which doesn't allow CRT's richness to be fully absorbed. In fact, please forgive me, I did call it cock blocking in some of my work. I eventually found out it was these emotionalities of whiteness that cock blocked the beauty of CRT. And I say that very, very poignantly because I got students who were learning CRT, but then they were misunderstanding the terminology and how it should be applied. I had white teacher candidates, and these are graduate students wanting to become teachers, right? They would start saying, well, I know all about racial microaggressions because I'm the only white person in the class. And I was like, yo, you're the teacher in the class. There's a power dynamic you're totally forgetting here. It doesn't work that way, And so I wrote about this. I talked about how learning CRT absent of how whiteness and the hegemony of whiteness and its support of white supremacy really needs to be entertained in ways that they can understand it's a both and situation. So in my work, I had to really think about how is whiteness operating in teacher education. I know Christine Sleeter said many years ago that there's an overwhelming presence of whiteness, yet in 2001, still at the time, in 2010, when I started doing the work, there was very few engagement, about as to what is this whiteness then? And why is it still overwhelming? And it's 2021, over 20 years later, right? So I started to really think about emotionalities, right? And how they can be weaponized, in ways that curtail the discussion and the learning and the acts of racial justice teaching and education. So for me, it was very important for me to marry the two, because I needed to, and I go back even now, because after 10 years, over 10 years of doing this, I realized in really focusing on whiteness, but I'm doing it from my positionality as a brown-skinned Pinay, right? I realize there's been this great growth in whiteness studies and teacher education, yet it becomes a little narcissistic when it doesn't connect to the humanity and the harm and the terror on Black and Indigenous people of color. So I think CRT and critical whiteness and whiteness studies is a perfect marriage to show how someone, why, and psychoanalytically, why someone engages in that terrorism, right? And how, when they express these emotions, then goes and impacts folks of color, you know? So I think for me, it was that beautiful marriage of how whiteness operates within the whiteness and critical whiteness studies, and how whiteness upholds white supremacy, which is the real institution that we need to deconstruct. We wouldn't have racism without white supremacy, right? So if we're studying the abusers, so to speak, in an abusive relationship, then we can also understand how their behaviors, their expressions, their rhetoric, their epistemology will then impact and abuse that of folks of color through CRT. So it was a perfect marriage for someone who focuses on teacher education.
Yeah, thank you. And so we've heard things like kinship and marriage and things of that nature to form bonds with CRT and education research. So I kind of want to make a small pivot away from that for a couple seconds, or a couple minutes actually, and talk a little bit about the misconceptions of CRT that have kind of taken a huge, a splurge in the media, right? In talking about how folks are misconceiving or misconceptualizing what CRT is. And so we want to show you two clips, and Dr. Brown is actually going to do that text situation. Yep. And while he's doing that, we're going to watch the videos, and then I'm going to ask you a question after we finish watching them. And we're going to watch both of them back to back.
Curriculum that appears well-intentioned, appealing, even empathetic, but in actuality, it further divides us. When you peel back the layers of this onion, you will see that it promotes taking from one group in order to compensate a second group, to correct injustices caused by a third group who mistreated a fourth group by an earlier point in history. It's absurd. Not only does it not promote justice, it does the opposite. It promotes racism. And you cannot cure racism with more racism.
Stop diluting student education with political correct, feel-good propaganda.
I didn't come prepared with statistics or anything. I'm just basically coming from a parent and my own personal experience as a parent. I'm the mother of a high school senior and an 8th grade son. And my fear is this type of curriculum will actually breed more racism and more divide in our country rather than unity. I fear that this is actually taking a step backward.
The recent events have brought to light the failure of our education system. The young people we witnessed rioting and looting in some of our largest cities came out of an education system that had taught them to hate America.
I'd rather empower people in minority groups to rise above and not do anything that's going to create a victim mentality, that if you're born a certain way, that you're now not afforded the same options in our country that everyone else is. Because I think we live in a country where if you put forth the effort, there's opportunities out there for everyone.
Parents calling out the school's social justice agenda as one teacher declares she has had enough.
Within the last year, I was told in one of my so-called equity trainings that white, Christian, able-bodied females currently have the power in our schools, and that, quote, this has to change. You shut the doors to the public, as well as the emails sent by the superintendent last year, reminding me that a dissenting opinion is not allowed, even to be spoken in my personal life, going so far as to send a form to my colleagues and I, encouraging us to fill it out. I quit your policies, I quit your trainings, and I quit being a cog in a machine that tells me to push highly politicized agendas on our most vulnerable constituents, the children.
Author Douglas Murray joins us now to react. Good morning to you.
Good morning.
Good morning. So, Douglas, you can tell she's obviously emotional. She probably doesn't want to leave these kids in that school district without having her teachings, but she's forced to. It's forcing good teachers to leave. What's your reaction?
This woman, Laura Morris, who's the teacher we just heard from, who resigned, really should be applauded, I think. It's clear from the tape how distressed she is about having to take this decision, but she felt she had to for reasons of conscience. As she says there, you know, it's a privilege to be a teacher. It's a privilege to help the next generation of young Americans grow up, to think, to be informed, and to be able to go out into the world. And it's clear, as she says to the Loudoun County Board, that's not a priority, actually, to the local school authorities. In fact, in their priority system, it's things like equity class. She refers there to the equity class that says that there is a privilege in being a white, female, able-bodied Christian teacher, and that this has to change. And the thing is, we all have to ask, as she did, why? What's wrong with being a white, Christian, able-bodied female teacher? What's wrong with it? If you're a good teacher, we should celebrate that.
All right. So you all saw those two clips, and we're going to start with you, Subini, first. And the question is, after watching these video clips of angry citizens and teachers, what stands out for you about how critical race theory is being understood?
I always have to like gather myself after I watch something like that, because the different things on display are so intriguing. Beyond the lack of wearing masks correctly, because I just have to point that out, that this is all happening during a pandemic where a lot of people have masks under their nose or are holding their masks in their hands as if that's going to protect the rest of us. What's noticeable to me is the employment of whiteness as a weapon. And I really appreciate Cheryl's work on this, Zeus Leonardo's work on this, folks who are helping us understand how whiteness is weaponized. Right, so from the dog whistle discourse, which again, Ian Haney Lopez helped us understand that. Sorry, it's Fleet Week here in San Francisco. The Blue Angels just flew over, and that's a whole nother conversation we can talk about of militarization and why we, the military industrial complex, but let me stay focused. But from the dog whistle discourse of young people rioting and looting in some of our larger cities, right, to using the language of victim mentality, and finally the combination of both white rage and white tears being used in this kind of powerful way and juxtaposed against each other. It's just a reminder how whiteness weaponizes different discourses and actions to threaten when it feels threatened, and the backlash that we have experienced, how this aligns with the backlash that we always experience when we experience racial progress, and was such a reminder of what Derek Bell wrote about with racial realism. And let's remember that even this backlash against CRT isn't new. When Obama was running for president, they tried to use his relationship with Derek Bell, which some of us think he deeply betrayed at some points. They try to use that as a weapon against him. So remember that even arguing against CRT isn't new. This is, and most of us know that what they are arguing about currently is not critical race theory, but any ways of teaching of the ways that racism entrenched in society. But I want to hear what Dr. Matthias thinks also.
Thank you so much. Well, that's why I wrote the book, Feeling White. Oh, you can't see that with the background, huh? How do you go closer? You go further? I can't see it, but I did write the book called Feeling White and then Surviving Becky's, right? So that's literally what we're dealing with here. And if we're going to go down to like critical emotion studies, we're thinking about two very interesting thing, and someone even said it in the Hades said it, all the white tears, and then Efren said, oh, look at how it's based on feelings, and that is how emotionality of whiteness work. The emotionalities of whiteness works in ways that are structured under white supremacy, such that they are given credence when they're actually nothing there. In fact, Robin DiAngelo did write before White Fragility. She wrote about how white feelings and their sense of fears are just sentimentalized. For example, she asked the question in her class, what is it that you fear when you have discussions about race and racism? And for whites, it was all sentimental things. Like, I'm afraid I might be called a racist, but it's not based on any tangible thing. Or it's like, I'm afraid I might be viewed as this, or I might say the wrong thing. These are all sentimentalized things. In fact, it's kind of like how George Yancey talks about that elevator effect. When he walks into that elevator as a Black man, and he's in the space with a white woman and she grabs her purse tighter, right? The racial phenomenological happenings that is going on here is that she is emotionally projecting her own sentimentalized fear that are not rooted in anything, not data, not anything, but rooted on stereotypes, and that was created because of white supremacy, to engage in behaviors that then impact folks of color. So the same thing here. And when Robin DiAngelo asked that same question to her students, for students of color, well, what is it that you fear when you're having the, a dialogue about race and racism? They're afraid of tangible things, like I might get fired, which has historically happened. I might get beat up. That has historically been happening. In fact, people have been killed. I might be ostracized from work. I might get written up. And these are all tangible. So we need to understand that when white emotionalities flare up, they flare up in ways that still continues to make people of color's feelings only 3/5 of a white person's feelings. And so, and they operationalize that in a way that cuts the discourse, and that way that continues to do harm unto our communities. And that's what we're seeing, not only in teacher ed, when people are afraid to talk about race or engage in racially just teaching, but we're seeing this happen now throughout the country. People are fearing of something they know not of. And that is how whiteness and white supremacy impacts us all. It makes us ignorant.
Yeah, thank you both for your remarks. I do have a follow-up question for you, Dr. Matthias, but Subini, if you want to add anything related to the videos that we watched, feel free. And also, I just want to make a quick note. Kendra put this in the chat. We're going to transition to Q&A. Feel free to put in the Q&A function, and then we're going to see which questions we're able to ask within our 15-minute of Q&A. RILE 2021, if you're on Twitter, Instagram, feel free to put the hashtag. If you're enjoying this, I'm definitely having a good time up here. But yeah, so Subini, if you want to add anything, if not, we can transition to the next question, but feel free to say something.
The only thing I want to just build on Professor Matthias's point about white ignorance, because I think a lot of this is being labeled as misconceptions about CRT. We're so worried about these white parents that they're just confused about what CRT is. But W.E.B. Du Bois and Charles Mills write about this as white ignorance. And I think this would actually be a much more productive framing. And so, yeah, and Cheryl just brought it up too in the chat, I saw it. So Du Bois refers to this in Abolitionist Democracy. He refers to deliberately educated ignorance of white schools. And what he's basically talking about is the and much love and power, rest in power, Charles Mills. But Du Bois talks about this as the deliberately educated ignorance of white schools. And then Mills takes this and writes a whole piece on multiple pieces on white ignorance. And I just want to read a quote. He says, "Ignorance is usually thought of as the passive averse to knowledge, the darkness retreating before the spread of enlightenment. But imagine an ignorance that resists. Imagine an ignorance that fights back. Imagine an ignorance militant, aggressive, not to be intimidated, an ignorance that is active, dynamic, that refuses to go quietly, not at all confined to the illiterate and uneducated, but propagated at the highest levels of the land, indeed presenting itself unblushingly as knowledge." And so to me, this is something that we really need to start thinking about framing more appropriately, because and I'm not critiquing the question, but just the larger frame of, I think a lot of us who are trying to push back on this are doing it in ways that kind of frame an innocence within the ignorance. And what Mills is telling us, and he also says that, in order to deny the cumulative effects of differential treatment by race, he says, what makes such a denial possible is the management of memory. And that's really what we're seeing here, is that folks are fighting to manage memory and to be in charge of who gets to manage these memories. And Dave Stovall and I wrote a piece for the Hetchinger report about the backlash to critical race theory. And what we were trying to make an argument for is that basically historical accuracy has become an existential threat to white supremacy. So I just want us to keep thinking about white ignorance as a frame, that it's really important, because I think it pushes us way past this idea of fragility, which is again, seems so tame and it's all about feelings, but this is about power and retaining power. And if we don't always hold that and we use kind of fluffy language, we protect whiteness even while we're trying to fight it.
Yeah, and actually, Dr. Matthias, this is actually segueing to your question. So Subini, I appreciate the alley-oop, and I'm going to take it. Talking about whiteness and critical whiteness studies in particular. So, you know, a lot of folks talk about the binary between Black people and white people, but you make this intriguing distinction between white people and whiteness, which is what Subini was alluding to as well, in terms of talking about structures and power. So can you explain a little bit more about this distinction and how it matters for education?
Absolutely. I think I do want to take a moment to say I love what Subini just said regarding this racial ignorance. It's an active ignorance. It's an active ignoring. That's what it is. And drawing from historical amnesia. And it's to do so to relinquish culpability. That's what it's doing, right? To relinquish any culpability. And they know this works. I mean, if you get pulled over by a cop, right, CHP, the first thing he's going to say is, do you know how fast you were going? The minute you say no, does that relinquish you of any responsibility of getting a ticket? Absolutely not. But they know because it's a white supremacist structure here, not only in education, but in the legal structure, right? That you have to prove intent to get a verdict of racial discrimination, right? Even though when you do a murder case, intent just delineates the severity of the punishment. It doesn't mean you didn't do it, right? But here in cases of racial discrimination or racism, we have to prove intent. That's how the white supremacist structure even embeds itself in court cases. So prove intent, and that's the maneuver whiteness will operate with. Not my intent is I have to engage in, because they know that will legally get them off. In fact, we know this ignorance is not true because of the fact that when Amanda Cooper decided to call the cops, right, in Central Park, she knew she can operationally switch to her emotionalities of whiteness to use it as a way to attack a Black man. So this is not an ignorance that someone doesn't know. They know how this engages. In fact, the tears you saw there is an operational manner. I don't want to hate on teachers because I know there's very few and far between. I call in instead of calling out some of these teachers to really think about how whiteness might help them understand why they're acting the way they are. In fact, you know, I invite that teacher to come take one of my classes. How's that? You know, I think she will learn. I'll do it for free, girl. You know, because if you are such a good teacher, if you believe in your babies, then you would take the time to interrogate that which is impacting your students, even if you believe it is not. So when you love someone, you think about think of, and I last what
Dr. Matias, can if you can hear me, oh, she left us. That's okay, because I know that she was gonna spit some fire and Zoom just didn't want to hear it. So we'll give it a couple moments to see if she can join us again. She was definitely too much for the internet. This is true. This is true. We do have a few questions that have come in through the Q&A function. So I appreciate you all for putting those in there. But it looks like we might be having her return.
My bad, I'm sorry. I was like texting my kids, get off the internet. Can you all hear me?
Yeah, we can hear
Sorry.
you.
Kids are home, so y'all know how this works with teenagers. But yeah, my point is, when I did this 12 years ago, I didn't realize that as it took off, I'm really happy to see that there's more interrogations of whiteness and white teachers. However, I noticed that it becomes almost narcissistic when they don't make the connection of how whiteness impacts their students of color, or for that matter, other folks of color in writ large, right? So I'm really going back, and what I've been doing to focus on is how I articulate, how I do a critical study of whiteness, in that it draws not only from Black, Indigenous scholars of color, not just to cite them that they started the field, years ago by citing Du Bois 1903, but really engaging the theories that they bring, and the scholarship that they bring, and how it really how by using them, we can understand these dynamics, these emotionalities, these power structures of emotions that then get played out in the educational system, right? Someone in the chat said, how do I teach this in a conservative Coachella Valley or area of California? It says, girl, I'm in Kentucky. I mean, for real. Like, the truth is, this is not a partisan politics. We need to pull away from that. It's not a partisan issue. This is a humanity issue. This is a human rights issue. And if we're focused on that, don't get me wrong, it's a politicized issue. It is very politicized, but remove ourselves from partisan politics and focus right now on this is a human rights issue that needs to be addressed in the classroom right now, because people are dying. People are dying. Our children are dying. We're afraid they won't come home. And that is not something we should take lightly. So I think when I do this studies on whiteness, I think a lot of things need to be understood. Those people who want to study, especially white scholars who want to study whiteness, the question in your research should always be, how is this connected to the liberation of Black, Indigenous people of color? Because if you're studying whiteness for whiteness sakes, that is narcissistic. It's self-aggrandizing. But if you're studying it and you're showing the connection, it then has onto folks of color. Then you're showing how one leads to the other, cause and effect. And so I think it's really important that as scholars go into this field, that they think about that. And for scholars of color who are coming into this field thinking about doing critical whiteness, do it, because we need that perspective. We need our focus, and we need a way to honor, a critical understanding of whiteness that comes from our positionalities.
Yeah, right on. It's almost the time to pivot to Q&A. However, there is one last question, and maybe we can get a few one-liners from both of you. I know this is unfair, but it just is what it is, right? But it's pretty clear for a lot of us that CRT, critical race theory, is actually not being taught in our schools. And I'm thinking about modern K through 12 schools. But if it were taught in schools, what is the value added to critical race theory in K through university classrooms? And Subini, we can start with you, a few words, and then Dr. Matthias, we'll hand it over to you, and then we'll transition over to Q&A.
I love that you're trying to get academics to get down to one line, Brian. You should know better by now. Honestly, first of all, I think we need to stop arguing CRT isn't taught in schools, not because you're wrong, but because I think we are spending so much time trying to, again, work against white ignorance, which is dangerous and which is fighting us purposefully, that we start kind of bobbing and weaving in all the wrong places. So like the point isn't whether or not CRT is being taught in schools. The point is that they're trying to squash any conversation around race and racism. And so we can be pushing back in multiple ways, because I think there actually is value to CRT being taught in schools. CRT, ultimately has power in its analysis, right? It's an analytical tool for students to understand how racism is perpetuated and how it lives in social institutions, all the way down to micro interactions. And so my argument always is, when this comes up, is why wouldn't you want Black and brown and white children to have the tools to dismantle structural inequality? Like, why wouldn't we want that? Like, of course we want that. So for an example, racial realism would help us in this moment understand that whiteness will always try to absolve itself of history while perpetuating new iterations of racism, right? Like if people just knew racial realism, we could talk about whiteness as property and how it addresses how white supremacy is fueled by the right to exclude. And that means excluding people from the curriculum. So just a couple of examples of how CRT tenets give us analytical tools to understand this moment and actually empower children and not make them into victims or whatever messy language the folks are using.
Am I supposed to talk right now? Right. All right. Well, I love that. I love, because Subini hit it right on the head. She says, don't we want to dismantle power structures? Don't we want to? The truth is they don't. Let's be honest. they don't want to admit it, but we kind of like how James Baldwin said, I don't believe what you say because I see what you do. It's the same thing applies here, in that the truth is they don't. When you see parents paying these obscene amounts, the Hollywood parents paying obscene amounts to cheat their way into Ivy League schools like like Harvard and then Stanford and big top tier schools like UCLA and Berkeley, and we know. They know they have the structural privilege to try to get in. And of course, they don't want to change that structure. They just don't want to admit it. But we see that, right? We see that. And I think it's really important to know. I think what we need to say is be very clear. So you really don't want this, right? You don't want this. Or people who resist, racial justice and teacher education program. So you don't believe in racial justice, don't you? Just admit it. You're racist. No, your whiteness is showing, So, but that's the truth. I mean, when Pedro Noguera said long ago that schools are designed urban schools are designed exactly how they're supposed to, which is have Black and brown students fail. That's what they did, That's what happens when you design an entire educational system under rooted in army intelligences that was used to justify the separation of Black and brown soldiers from white, to say they were intellectually inferior. There's your bell curve, right? So if we're going to continue to use that as the basis of what constitutes academic success, then absolutely, what they want to do is stratify society. Let's just be realistic. And so I think if we move forward with saying that CRT, although they're not reading Derek Bell or Kimberly Crenshaw, but if we guide and use it as our principles to create a more equitable educational system, then we need to do just that and stop fearing something that we don't know and pick up a book and read.
Thank you for your remarks. I'm going to actually ask a question from the audience that's very related to both of your remarks. And it's about, CRT is very much about storytelling. And so what is the best way, and this is from an anonymous attendee, so shout out to whoever this was, but what is the best way to tell the truth about history under CRT lenses without reverting to teaching historical myths? And how do you do this to turn people around without insulting them or inciting additional divisiveness, especially when dealing with racial issues in US public school context?
I mean, I can hop in and just say, I think we need to stop being afraid of divisiveness in the language that it's being pitched as an us against them, instead of recognizing what's best for kids. And this idea, and what I'm going to continually say, is that having the tools to understand racism is best for all kids. So the idea that this is going to make white children feel bad and, you know, make white teachers cry is such an interesting, you only feel bad if you've decided that you can't do anything about it, right? So like empowering those kids. So that's the constant language. And I agree with Cheryl when she says, let's ask them why they don't want racial justice. Let's ask them why equity scares them. Let's ask them the questions. I think we need to be much more aggressive in the sense of like, why are we in places like California and other places not pushing for school boards to actively support teaching critical race theory in our school? Why are we not getting a wave of parents to do those types of things? I mean, the idea that we're just going to sit and wait until it comes to us and wait till we're under attack seems like the wrong move here, because we know that that's how backlash works. So I think, just for me at least, I don't know if I really answered the first question about, you know, like how we tell this story, but the story to me is about how this is an analytical tool that empowers kids. And so to me, that's the most important story to tell. And I'm not worried if folks think that's divisive to talk about racial justice, then I can't help you with that. Like that's you just gotta embrace your racism then.
Embrace your inner racism, right?
It's not even inner at that point, is it?
No, it's not. It's like straight up, I don't like you people. I don't want to learn about you people. And I don't want to know that you're around. Can you just be shh, shh, like we did before? You know, it's like, can we segregate you into communities so I don't have to see you? Can we take away your histories in our textbooks so I don't have to know that you exist? You know, like it's just ridiculousness. I love this. You know, I often ask my teacher, and this comes off what Dr. Annamma just said about you feel how they feel bad, right? And I always ask this, you always ask teachers, like, why do you want to be a teacher? And then you get, you know, the majority of white, you know, middle class teachers say, oh, well, I want to, you know, I love kids, you know, and I told you, you know, I always come back with, well, so do pedophiles, you know, what makes you distinct, you know, what makes your love distinct. And then a lot of them say, and if they're liberal, you know, they'll say, well, you know, and they know the words, I've had white privilege, and therefore I grew up in a middle-class community, and therefore I want to give back. They say that, you know, and we in liberal discourse, and using Eduardo Bonilla Silva's framework in the semantic maneuvers, we know this abstract liberalism it sounds good, right? But then I asked them a question. So you think about these teachers who've never been in urban communities of color, but yet they want to give back. So I always ask them, so what is it that you have taken from those communities such that now you feel so compelled to give back? And that goes back to what Subini was saying, that they feel bad. And they're using this as some moral justification for their own sense of morality, right? Kind of like how Miss Anne, you know, the Miss Anne type during plantation times would sit on the porch with Black slaves and Black slave children and preach the Bible because slavery was wrong. And to rectify that the immoral being, I'm going to teach them the Bible, right? So taking from communities of color and from folks of color is wrong, but I'm going to feel better by going back to urban schools and saying that I'm saving them when they're not, you know. So it becomes this very quandary. So the feeling bad is because they've known that they have done wrong by us, right? And so that's a lot that needs to be encountered. And you're talking about stories. Well, if you want stories, Derek Bell's Faces at the Bottom of the Well is written there's no citations. I know we're tired as academics, we're tired of reading citations. Well, if you're tired, go read Derek Bell again. Afrolantica has appealed to me every single time I lecture in a class. In fact, Surviving Becky's, self-promotion right there. It has no citations either. These are stories. And at the end, they even engage in pedagogical questions for folks of color who have to survive these Becky's, and for those Becky's who might have engaged in those behaviors. In fact, if you truly want to be a better person, would it not be beneficial to reflect on your own behaviors and how it impacts others? That's therapy 101. So then do better and do it for yourself. I do want to say it's coming out. I'll announce it here that there will be a special issues coming out in honor of Charles. He was a great scholar for all of us, and he's near and dear to the hearts of many. His scholarship alone has really touched all facets of the discipline, from education to sociology to even in areas of environmental sciences, and how the racial contracts happen in the whiteness of national parks systems and who has access to that. So I just think it's important to pay homage. And just so you know, like it's been hard for me to talk about it. I know he's close to much. He was close to me. He was someone who made me feel like I wasn't crazy when I nerded out. And he's always like that dad that, you know, when you talk to them on Zoom or Marco Polo, they were like this. They only had their forehead on there, you know. But Charles was a great scholar. And as a woman in the academy, we're oftentimes a little cautious about men of color in the academy, but he was that great mentor, human being, and not only a wonderful scholar. So I want to make sure that people here who are listening right now know Charles Mills is the Charles Mills and always will be the Charles Mills, but he's also Charles, who meant a lot to many of us. So just want to say that.
Yeah, so thank you both, Subini and Dr. Cheryl Matias. I unfortunately don't have any more time for questions, so I'm gonna have to give this virtual floor and space back to Dr. Brown, but I just wanna say very quickly, there's a lot of good questions that I think a lot of folks here are riled up about learning and talking more about CRT and its kind of undertakings and expansions. And I think a lot of the questions are surrounding around how do we organize? How do we combat against this backlash and things of that nature? So it's been a pleasure, really hyped and a privilege to be here in conversation with you. And Dr. Brown, I'm gonna give this right back to you.
All right, thank you, Brian. I want to thank our team, in particular, Terrence Turner, Kendra Sabomahim, Coco Massengale have done an incredible job in helping us coordinate this event. And I want to go, before we do that, also say thank you to our participants today, Subini Annamma, happy birthday, and Cheryl Matias for enlightening us today. One of the things I want to take us back to is this very notion of challenging our defaults. If we think forward, we have to question the things that we assume about people, the things we assume about curriculum, and the things we assume about research. But most importantly, our success is tied to our collective relationships. And so we want you to join us. At no point was RILE intended to be a virtual online community. We wanted to connect the Bay Area. And one of the benefits of this unfortunate time is we learn to use these technological tools. So we hope to do both in the future, meaning this. We'll have online events, and we invite you all to join us, Bay Area people. This is a way for us to get together to do meaningful work, to explore these intersections together. So as we move forward, we challenge you to push beyond the boundaries of contemporary frameworks, to think critically about what it means to read the work that really challenges our ideas and push it forward. Those new ideas are the things that will improve modern teaching and learning. With that said, our graduate students, we invite you to join us at right after for our discussion. So if you're a graduate student, join us for our post-talk conversation. Additionally, we're going to close Latinx Heritage Month on the 15th. And so you get an email everyone at 4:15 announcing that event. You don't want to miss it. So thank you all for a great week. I've learned a lot. I'm looking forward to continued discussions. Let's make this the first of many conversations we have together. Thank you on behalf of my incredible colleagues here at Stanford and in our RILE program. We hope to see you again in person. Thank you very much.